GPS died the moment Maria's car crossed into the shadow of Blackwood Forest, its screen flickering once before going completely black. Thunder rumbled overhead as rain began pelting her windshield in fat, angry drops. Maria cursed under her breath, squinting through the darkness at the narrow dirt road that had seemed like such a reasonable shortcut 20 minutes ago. Her phone showed no signal, just a red X mocking her from the corner of the screen. The headlights carved weak tunnels through the pressing darkness, illuminating gnarled tree trunks that seemed to lean inward like arthritic fingers. Ancient oaks and twisted pines crowded the roadside, their branches forming a canopy so thick that even the storm's fury was muffled to whispers above. Maria checked the time. 11:47 p.m. She should have been home hours ago, safe in her apartment with a hot cup of tea and terrible reality TV. Instead, she was lost in the middle of nowhere, with a gas tank hovering dangerously close to empty, and a growing certainty that this shortcut had been a catastrophic mistake. The road ahead forked unexpectedly. Maria hit the brakes, her tires sliding slightly on the wet gravel. To the left, the path seemed to curve deeper into the forest's heart. To the right, it appeared to climb upward, perhaps toward civilization. She chose right. The engine coughed once, twice, then settled into an uneasy rhythm. Maria pressed the accelerator gently, not wanting to risk stalling in this godforsaken place. The trees here were different, older, more twisted, with bark that looked almost black in her headlights. Moss hung from their branches like funeral shrouds, swaying in the wind with an unsettling, hypnotic motion. Something pale flickered between the trees. Maria's heart skipped. She slowed the car, leaning forward to peer into the darkness. There, about 50 yards into the forest, something white was moving. It was too tall to be an animal, too fluid to be a person. The shape vanished. "Just tired," she whispered to herself, but her knuckles were white on the steering wheel. Just seeing things. The road began to narrow, forcing overhanging branches to scrape against her car's roof, with sounds like fingernails on metal. Maria winced at each screech, imagining the scratches being carved into her paint job. Her insurance would never believe this. Then she saw the sign. It emerged from the darkness like a warning from another world. Weathered wood held up by a rotting post, with words carved deep enough to catch her headlights' glow. Dead Man's Hollow, 2 miles below it, in smaller letters that were barely legible. Turn back while you still can. Maria's blood turned to ice water. The rational part of her mind insisted it was just some local's idea of a prank, something to scare teenagers or city folk who wandered into their backwoods territory. But the primal part of her brain was screaming at her to reverse, to floor it backward down this nightmare road until she found the main highway again. She was still staring at the sign when something thumped against her passenger side window. Maria's scream caught in her throat as she spun toward the sound. The window was empty, just rain streaming down the glass and her own terrified reflection staring back. But the thump had been real, solid, like something heavy hitting the car. Her hand shook as she fumbled for the door locks, pressing the button repeatedly until she heard the reassuring click of all 4 doors securing. The engine idled roughly, coughing like a sick animal. Another thump, this time from behind. Maria's eyes flew to the rearview mirror, but all she could see was the red glow of her taillights disappearing into absolute blackness. The rain was coming down harder now, turning the world beyond her windows into a liquid nightmare. Thump, thump, thump. Something was circling her car. Maria's breath came in short, panicked gasps. She had to get out of here. Now she shifted into drive and pressed the accelerator, but the car barely moved. The tires spun uselessly on the increasingly muddy road. Come on, she pleaded, pumping the gas pedal. The engine revved, whined, then caught. The car lurched forward, fishtailing slightly before finding purchase. In her side mirror, she glimpsed something pale disappearing back into the trees. The road climbed steeply now, winding through dense forest that seemed to press closer with each passing mile. Maria kept her foot steady on the accelerator, fighting the urge to floor it. The last thing she needed was to slide off the road and into those hungry-looking trees. Her headlights swept across more signs as she drove. Danger, unstable ground, no camping, no hiking, no exceptions. Missing persons last seen in this area. That last one made her stomach clench. The sign looked official, with a state park logo and everything. How many people had taken this same shortcut? How many had simply disappeared? The radio crackled to life suddenly, making Maria jump. Static filled the car, then cleared to reveal a voice. Distant, distorted, barely human. Don't go to the hollow, they're waiting. They're always waiting. Maria lunged for the radio, frantically turning the dial, but found only more static. She switched it off with a sharp click, and the silence that followed felt even more oppressive than the voice. The trees were changing again. These were ancient things, their trunks so wide that her headlights couldn't find their edges. Their branches wove together overhead in impossible patterns, creating a tunnel of living wood that seemed to pulse and breathe around her car. And there were sounds now, sounds that the rain couldn't quite mask. Rustling that was too rhythmic to be wind, breathing that was too deep to be human. Whispers in a language that predated words. Maria pressed harder on the accelerator. The speedometer climbed to 30, then 40. Too fast for this road, but not fast enough to escape whatever was keeping pace with her car in the darkness beyond her windows. She caught movement in her peripheral vision and turned to see pale shapes flitting between the massive tree trunks. They moved wrong, too fluid, too quick, like smoke given form. When she tried to focus on one, it would melt back into shadow, only to reappear somewhere else. They were herding her. Whatever was out there wasn't just following her, it was guiding her deeper into the forest, cutting off escape routes, ensuring she had no choice but to continue toward whatever waited in Dead Man's Hollow. The road crested a hill, and Maria's headlights illuminated a sight that made her slam on the brakes. A car sat abandoned in the middle of the road. It was old, maybe from the 1980s, covered in rust and moss. The driver's door hung open like a screaming mouth. The windows were spider-webbed with cracks, and something dark stained the seats. Maria's car skidded to a stop just feet from the wreck. In the sudden silence, she could hear her heart hammering against her ribs. The abandoned car blocked the entire road. There was no way around it. She would have to get out. Maria sat frozen behind the wheel, staring at the abandoned car. Getting out was suicide, but staying here was death by degrees. Whatever was hunting her was growing bolder. She could see shapes moving just beyond her headlight beams, pale forms that seemed to test the boundaries of light and shadow. The fuel gauge needle touched empty. "No, no, no," Maria whispered, tapping the gauge desperately. But the engine was already beginning to sputter, the headlights dimming as the car's electrical system prepared to die. She had minutes, maybe less. Maria grabbed her phone, Still no signal, and activated its flashlight. The LED beam was pathetically weak compared to her headlights, but it was something. She checked the doors again, took a deep breath that tasted of fear and rain, and stepped out into the storm. The cold hit her like a physical blow. Rain soaked through her jacket in seconds, and the wind carried sounds that made her skin crawl, chittering, scraping, whispers just below the threshold of understanding. The pale shapes in the forest had gone still. Maria approached the abandoned car cautiously, her phone's light dancing across its rusted surface. The license plate was too corroded to read, but she could make out a parking sticker on the rear window. Millbrook College, class of '87. 38 years ago. The driver's door creaked as she pulled it wider. The interior was a nightmare of decay. Seats rotted through to the springs, dashboard cracked and warped, and covering everything was a layer of something that looked like cocoon silk. On the passenger seat, partially wrapped in the webbing, were clothes. Human clothes, a purse, a class ring. Maria backed away, her light trembling. This wasn't just an abandoned car. It was a tomb. Something moved in the forest behind her. Maria spun around, her light cutting through the darkness, to reveal a pale figure standing between two massive trees. It was humanoid, but wrong. Too tall, too thin, with limbs that bent at impossible angles. Its skin was translucent, showing the dark network of veins beneath. And its face was a smooth expanse of flesh with no features except for a mouth that split its head nearly in half. The thing's jaw unhinged like a snake's, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth that gleamed wetly in her flashlight beam. It made a sound, part hiss, part whisper, part dying scream. Maria ran. She vaulted over the hood of the abandoned car and sprinted down the road, her flashlight beam bouncing wildly. Behind her, the forest erupted in movement. Trees creaked and swayed as things that had no business existing dropped from their branches and gave chase. The road curved sharply, and Maria nearly fell as her feet slipped on the wet gravel. She could hear them behind her, dozens of them, their claws scraping against stone, their inhuman voices creating a symphony of hunger. Ahead, the forest opened into a clearing. Dead Man's Hollow. Maria stumbled into the open space and immediately understood why it had earned its name. The clearing was a perfect circle, maybe 100 yards across, surrounded by trees so old and massive they seemed like the pillars of some primordial cathedral. But it was what filled the clearing that made her soul scream. Bones. Thousands upon thousands of bones scattered across the muddy ground like the remnants of a giant's feast. Human bones, animal bones, and others that belonged to nothing that should exist on Earth. They gleamed white in her flashlight beam, picked clean and polished smooth. And rising from the center of this charnel ground was a structure that defied description. Part tree, part building, part living nightmare. Its bark was black as pitch, twisted into impossible spirals that hurt to look at. Windows opened in its trunk like wounds, and from those windows pale figures watched with eyes that reflected her light like mirrors. The things that had chased her emerged from the tree line, surrounding the clearing but not entering. They stood at the forest's edge like a gallery of the damned, their mouths hanging open, their translucent skin pulsing with anticipation. Maria backed towards the center of the clearing, stepping carefully between the scattered bones. Her light played across the twisted tree structure, revealing details that made her sanity fray at the edges. The bark wasn't bark. It was compressed flesh, Human faces pressed together in eternal screams. The windows weren't windows. They were eye sockets in skulls the size of houses. And the pale watchers inside weren't standing in rooms. They were embedded in the walls, part of the structure itself. Their bodies merged with the organic architecture in ways that spoke of centuries of slow, careful cultivation. "Welcome," said a voice that came from everywhere and nowhere. "We've been waiting." The tree thing pulsed, and Maria saw that what she had taken for roots were actually veins, pumping something dark and viscous through the ground beneath her feet. The clearing wasn't just a killing ground, it was a feeding site. Every death, every drop of blood, every scream of terror fed the monstrosity at its heart. Maria looked at the faces in the bark, the embedded watchers in the windows, and understood with crystalline horror that they had all been like her once. Lost travelers who had taken the shortcut through the woods, people who had ignored the warnings and paid the ultimate price. The pale figures at the forest's edge began to move forward, their feet making no sound on the bone-littered ground. Their mouths opened wider, impossibly wide, revealing throats that went down and down into darkness. Maria raised her flashlight like a weapon, though she knew it was useless. The light was already dimming as the battery died. Soon she would be in complete darkness with these things. "Please," she whispered. The tree thing laughed with 1,000 voices. Pale figures closed in like a tide of nightmares, their translucent skin rippling in the dying light of Maria's phone. She could see the dark networks of veins beneath their flesh, pulsing in rhythm with the massive tree thing at the hollow's heart. But as they approached, Maria noticed something that filled her with new horror. The figures weren't identical. Some were taller, some shorter. Some had the remnants of clothing embedded in their translucent flesh. And their faces, what should have been smooth expanses of skin, bore the faint impressions of human features, like death masks pressed into wax. They had been people once. All of them. "The transformation is beautiful," the voice from the tree whispered, and Maria could see which of the embedded figures was speaking. A woman whose face was pressed against the inside of one of the larger windows, her mouth moving in perfect synchronization with the words. "Peaceful. You won't remember the pain." The closest pale figure reached out with fingers that were too long, too jointed. Its touch was cold as winter earth, and where it made contact with Maria's arm, her skin began to change. The color drained away like water, leaving behind translucent flesh that showed the blue network of her veins. Maria screamed and jerked away, but the damage was done. She could feel something crawling beneath her skin, spreading from the point of contact like ice through her bloodstream. Her arm was going numb, the sensation creeping steadily toward her shoulder. Another figure grabbed her other arm, then her legs. They lifted her off the ground with inhuman strength, carrying her toward the tree thing that dominated the hollow. Up close, she could see that the structure was even more horrific than she had imagined. The compressed faces in the bark were still moving, their eyes tracking her approach, their mouths opening and closing in silent pleas, or perhaps warnings. The pale figures carried her to a section of the tree where the bark had split open like a wound, revealing a cavity just large enough for a human body. The walls of the cavity pulsed with a wet, organic rhythm, and Maria realized with nauseating clarity that this was how the transformation happened. The tree would consume her, digest her, rebuild her into something else. "Every 20 years we harvest," the embedded woman's voice continued. "Travelers who ignore the warnings, who think they know better, who take shortcuts through places they don't understand. Maria struggled against the pale figure's grip, but her transformed arm wouldn't respond to her commands. The numbness was spreading faster now, racing through her bloodstream toward her heart. Soon, she wouldn't be able to move at all. The first harvest was in 1823, another voice joined in, a man whose face was pressed against a lower window. A family of settlers who tried to cross the forest in winter. They fed us for decades. The second was in 1843, a group of surveyors. 1863, Confederate deserters. 1883, a traveling preacher and his congregation. The voices multiplied, dozens of them speaking in unison, reciting the dates like a litany. Maria realized she was hearing the testimony of everyone who had ever been consumed by this place. Their consciousnesses preserved and merged into the collective nightmare that was the tree thing. They positioned her at the mouth of the cavity, and she could feel heat radiating from within. The walls were lined with something that looked like digestive fluid, ready to break down her flesh and remake it according to the tree's design. 2003, a new voice said, and Maria recognized the parking sticker she had seen on the abandoned car. College students on spring break. 2023, said another. A family of 4, lost during a camping trip. 2025, the tree thing whispered with anticipation. Maria Chen, age 28, accountant from Portland, took the shortcut through Blackwood Forest on a rainy Tuesday night. Maria's phone chose that moment to die completely, plunging the hollow into absolute darkness. But somehow she could still see. The tree thing was phosphorescent, glowing with a sickly green light that illuminated the entire clearing. The pale figures holding her were luminous too, their translucent skin casting its own ghostly radiance. She was becoming one of them. The realization brought a strange calm. The fear was still there, but it was distant now, muffled by the creeping numbness that had reached her chest. Her heart was slowing, her breathing becoming shallow. Soon the transformation would be complete, and she would join the collective consciousness that dwelt within the tree. But as the pale figures prepared to thrust her into the cavity, Maria noticed something they had overlooked. Her phone might be dead, but the GPS unit in her car had been transmitting data before it failed. Modern cars were equipped with emergency beacons that activated during crashes or breakdowns. Somewhere, somehow, there would be a record of her last known location. "Help will come," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The tree thing laughed. "They always say that. But who would believe such a story? And even if they did, what would they find? Just another abandoned car, another missing person report to file away and forget." Maria felt herself being pushed toward the cavity, its heat washing over her face like breath from hell. The digestive fluids began to smoke as they prepared to receive her. But then she heard it, distant but growing closer. The sound of engines, multiple engines. The pale figures froze. The tree thing's glow flickered uncertainly. "Search and rescue," Maria gasped, understanding flooding through her transformed mind. "I'm a missing person. They have protocols." The sound grew louder. Helicopters, search dogs, vehicles with powerful lights that were already beginning to penetrate the forest canopy. "They'll find my car," Maria continued, her voice gaining strength even as her body failed. "They'll follow the road. They'll see the signs. And when they find this place..." The tree thing's glow intensified, and the faces embedded in its bark began to scream, not in triumph, but in rage and fear. "They'll burn it all down," Maria whispered. The first searchlight cut through the forest canopy like a sword of burning white, sweeping across the treetops and sending the pale figures scattering toward the shadows. The tree thing's phosphorescent glow dimmed, as if it were trying to hide from the approaching lights. But it was too late. Maria's emergency beacon had done its work. The sound of helicopters grew thunderous as they circled overhead, their searchlights turning night into day. Through the breaks in the canopy, Maria could see at least 3 aircraft, with more arriving every minute. On the ground, she could hear the distant baying of tracking dogs and the shouts of rescue teams pushing through the underbrush. The pale figures holding her began to retreat, their grip loosening as panic spread through their collective consciousness. They had evolved to hunt in darkness and secrecy, to take their victims one by one without witnesses. This exposure, this invasion of light and sound and human determination, was their antithesis. Maria felt herself slipping from their grasp, falling to the bone-littered ground of the hollow. The transformation was still progressing, but more slowly now, as if the approaching rescue had disrupted whatever dark process was remaking her flesh. 20 years, the tree thing moaned, its 1,000 voices raised in anguish. 20 years of waiting, 20 years of hunger. "And now it ends," Maria gasped, forcing herself to her knees among the scattered bones. The first rescue team burst into the clearing. 3 men in orange uniforms with powerful LED arrays that banished every shadow. They stopped short at the sight before them. The bone field, the impossible tree, the pale figures cowering at the forest's edge. "Jesus Christ," one of them breathed into his radio. "We need backup, lots of backup, and call the CDC, maybe the military." But even as he spoke, the pale figures were dissolving. Their translucent flesh became smoke, then mist, then nothing at all. Without darkness to sustain them, they simply ceased to exist. The tree thing was harder to kill. It writhed and screamed as more searchlights focused on it, its bark cracking and splitting as the faces embedded within tried to escape the blazing illumination. Dark fluid poured from the wounds, steaming where it touched the ground. "Maria Chen," one of the rescuers called, approaching cautiously with his light trained on her transformed arm. "We're here to get you out." Maria tried to stand but found her legs wouldn't support her. The rescuer, his name tag read Martinez, knelt beside her, his professional calm barely masking his horror at her condition. "Medical," he shouted into his radio. "We need medical support now. Possible chemical exposure. Unknown agent." More teams poured into the clearing. Someone threw a thermal blanket around Maria's shoulders. Through it all, the tree thing continued its death throes, its screams gradually fading to whispers as the constant exposure to artificial light ate away at its supernatural substance. "The others," Maria managed to say, pointing at the faces in the bark. "Save the others." But Martinez shook his head grimly. "They're gone, ma'am. Been gone a long time." As if his words were a signal, the embedded faces began to fade, not dissolving like the pale figures, but finally finding peace. One by one, they turned to look at Maria with expressions of gratitude before vanishing forever. The woman who had spoken first was the last to go. "Thank you," she mouthed silently. And the tree thing gave one final, earth-shaking scream and collapsed in on itself, its massive form crumbling to ash that the wind scattered across the hollow. Where it had stood, nothing remained but a circle of poisoned earth and the lingering stench of centuries-old decay. "Let's get you out of here," Martinez said, helping Maria onto a stretcher as paramedics surrounded her. As they carried her toward the forest's edge, Maria caught sight of something that made her heart skip. Her car sitting exactly where she had left it, with the abandoned wreck still blocking the road beyond. "How did you find me?" she asked weakly. Martinez smiled for the first time since entering the hollow. "Your car's emergency system sent out a ping before it died. Plus, we had reports of strange lights in the forest. Local legends, mostly. But when someone goes missing, we investigate everything." They reached the tree line, and Maria looked back one last time at Dead Man's Hollow. In the harsh glare of the searchlights, it looked almost ordinary, just a clearing full of old bones and dead vegetation. The magic was gone. The nightmare finally ended. But as the helicopter lifted her towards safety, Maria realized with growing horror that the transformation hadn't stopped. Her arm was still translucent, still changing. Whatever the tree thing had started, her rescue had only slowed it down. "Doctor," she called to the paramedic monitoring her vitals. "The change, it's still happening." He followed her gaze to her arm, and his face went pale. "We'll figure it out," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Maria closed her eyes and tried not to think about what would happen when the transformation was complete. Would she become like the pale figures, hunting travelers in whatever dark corner of the world the authorities relocated her to? Would she hunger for human flesh and fear the light? Or would she find a way to use her condition for good, to hunt the hunters, to protect the innocent from the things that stalked the spaces between civilization? Through the helicopter's window, she could see the forest stretching endlessly in all directions, dark and full of secrets. Blackwood Forest was just one nightmare among thousands. Who knew what other horrors lurked in the wild places of the world, waiting for the next lost traveler to take a shortcut through the woods? Maria felt her heart slow, her breathing deepen, her human needs falling away one by one. The transformation was accelerating now, feeding on her proximity to the supernatural site they had just left. She had perhaps hours before the change was complete. The question was, what would she choose to become? As the helicopter carried her toward the lights of civilization, Maria made her decision. She would not be a victim. She would not be a monster. She would be something new entirely. The last thing she remembered before the transformation claimed her completely was the feeling of power flowing through her translucent veins, ancient power, dark power, but hers to control. The pale figures were gone, the tree thing was dead, but their legacy lived on in her changing flesh. And Maria Chen had plans for that legacy. Big plans. 6 months later, Detective Ray Morrison stood at the edge of another clearing in another forest, staring at another scene that defied explanation. The official report would cite unexplained deaths due to exposure, but Morrison had seen enough of these cases to know better. 15 pale, desiccated bodies arranged in a perfect circle around a sapling that definitely hadn't been there the day before. The tree was already 6 feet tall, its bark black as night, its branches reaching toward the sky like grasping fingers. "Same as the others?" his partner asked, lighting a cigarette with shaking hands. Morrison nodded grimly. This was the 7th site they'd found in the past month, scattered across 3 states. Always the same pattern, evidence of some kind of ritual, bodies drained of blood and fluids, and a new tree growing from ground that soil experts insisted was perfectly normal. Except for the radiation readings, those were anything but normal. "Sir?" One of the forensics technicians approached nervously. We found something. He held up a cell phone in an evidence bag. The screen was cracked, but Morrison could still make out the last text message sent. Found another nest. These things are spreading faster than we thought. Moving to Containment Protocol 7. If you don't hear from me in 48 hours, burn everything. M. Morrison pocketed the phone and looked back at the sapling. In the growing twilight, he could swear it was glowing with a faint, sickly light. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, but it didn't sound quite like a wolf. It sounded hungry. Morrison turned to his partner. Call the CDC. Tell them we need a full hazmat team. What should I tell them we're dealing with? Morrison looked at the dead bodies, the impossible tree, the darkening forest beyond. He thought about Maria Chen, the accountant who had vanished in Blackwood Forest 6 months ago, and whose case file had been sealed by federal agents the day after her rescue. He thought about the other missing persons reports that had been flooding in from forests across the country. People who took shortcuts, people who ignored warnings, people who thought they knew better. Tell them, Morrison said quietly, that we're dealing with evolution. As they packed up their equipment and prepared to leave, none of them noticed the pale figure watching from the shadows between the trees. It had once been human, but that was a long time ago now. It had learned to hunt in daylight, to hide among ordinary people, to spread its kind slowly and carefully. It had learned patience, and it had learned that the real shortcut was never through the woods. It was through the cities, where no one expected monsters to walk among them, where a pale stranger could knock on any door and be invited inside. The figure smiled, revealing teeth like needles, and began the long walk toward the nearest town. After all, it had work to do. The harvest was just beginning.